You can't just influence people's behavior. You can't just say to them, I want you to do this and I want you to do that. You'll get compliance, but you won't get commitment that way. A leader is somebody who is able, through both words and actions, to influence the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of those they seek to lead.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leadership. My guest this time is Willie Pietersen. He was raised in South Africa and received a Rhodes scholarship to Oxford University. After practicing law, he embarked on an international business career. He served as chief executive of several multi-billion-dollar businesses, including Lever Foods and Seagram USA. He's been a consultant to some of the world's best-known organizations, ranging from Bosch & Lomb, Boeing, and Deloitte, to Johnson & Johnson, ExxonMobile, and the Girl Scouts of America. For nearly 3 decades, Willie has taught strategy and the leadership of change at the Columbia University Graduate School of Business. His latest book is titled Leadership, The Inside Story, Time-Tested Prescriptions for Those Who Seek to Lead. Willie, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you so much, Roger. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Please tell us, if you would, what you learned about leadership as you grew up under an apartheid regime in South Africa.
It's really interesting how our views are formed from an early age. And some of the most impressionable of these are really highly formative and begin to really shape who we are as leaders. So, as you mentioned, I was born in South Africa and raised there. And in my very early years, I was living under the policies of the apartheid regime. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word meaning separateness, and it's pronounced apartheid, which I think is rather noteworthy. Now, in the early years of growing up, it was not yet formally engraved and enshrined into legal restrictions. There were some mild ones, but there were some social conventions, and they caused what I look back now and I realize these were imprints on my mind. You know, you grow up, you get born into a world that you haven't studied before. And your mind is influenced by all the factors around you, the authority figures, your teachers, your parents, and the conventions and behaviors that you see around you. You absorb them, and you take them as this is the way the world works. There is no different way. This is the only way. Now, some of the things, for example, black people would refer to white people always in a way of respect. In a kind of a hierarchical sense. So white men were always called, and this is the Afrikaans word, baas, means boss. Good afternoon, boss. You would always say that. If you meet somebody in the street, you'd say boss. Now, when I was very young, they called me Basi, which is little boss. And white women were always called madam. Not Mrs. Pietersen or anything like that, but madam. There's a mark of respect, and there was the hierarchy. My parents always taught me to show respect to the black folks, but, the black housemaid would make my bed and cook food for us, etc., etc. So that's the world I grew up on, and that was the kind of mental imprinting that I started with. Then as time went along, and I went to college first in South Africa and then subsequently at Oxford, I began to see the world from the outside in. to be a little bit more discriminating in my understanding of things and understanding context for the first time, and began to feel disturbed about what was going on in South Africa, and a kind of a deep sense that there was something wrong with this system. In 1948, by the way, these conventions were enshrined into very, very draconian laws. You were not allowed to marry across the color bar. You were not allowed to cohabit in any way or live together in the same neighborhood. Kids of different races couldn't go to the same schools. Sexual relationships across the color bar were illegal, and you could go to jail for that. So this was the world that I eventually grew up into, the way it morphed into that. When I went back from Oxford to South Africa, I practiced law in Cape Town. And I'll tell you my pivotal experience that finally shaped my point of view and my sense of values. There was a board called the Race Classification Board. And people could be dragged in front of this board and classified if their race was ambiguous. And very often, in the Race Classification Board, there was no appeal to a higher court, only to the Minister of the Interior. The findings were kind of absolute. And what we found is that members of the same family were pulled apart. Kids of the same family were sent to different schools. People already married were told that their marriage was null and void because they'd married across the color bar. I was given a number of these cases to handle as a lawyer in front of the Race Classification Board. And what I observed was chilling in the extreme. Members of the Race Classification Board were examining these people as if they were laboratory specimens, putting a pencil in their hair to test the kinkiness, looking at the tone of their skin through kind of microscopes and so on, talking amongst themselves about how do we classify this person. It was revolting to observe the indignity that people were exposed to, all in the interests of separation of the races. And that was the final pivotal moment for me. I went home that night and said to my wife, we can no longer live in this country. We cannot start and raise a family in this country. It is absolutely unacceptable, and we have to leave. And my pathway out of South Africa then was to leave the legal profession and get into the corporate world. And I applied for a job with Unilever because it was an international organization, and was lucky enough then to have an international career that took me out of South Africa. And I now live in the United States. I've been very lucky with that international business career. So that's a bit of the story, the evolution of one's thinking, the realization that you really have to monitor your own thinking, examine your own biases, and understand how that can distort your sense of what's true and what's just in life.
That's an amazing story, and I can certainly see how all of that experience would certainly have a powerful impact on your paradigms regarding a lot of things. Integrated leadership, you say, is the intersection of three leadership domains: leadership of self, strategic leadership, and interpersonal leadership. Can you tell us why and how that intersection is important to a leader's success?
Yes, certainly. Well, the first thing I think to understand is that leadership occurs in different settings. You've got national leadership. That's the politicians who are in charge of a country. You've got military leadership, and that's the job of the generals and senior officers. You get organizational leadership in commercial and not-for-profit organizations. And then at a more personal level, you've got leadership that you exert within families, looking after elders, being a good grandfather, being a good husband or wife, being a good friend. These are all leadership demands that bring out the best in others. So first, I think we need to understand that. It's an interesting thing. It's a bit like motorists When pedestrians are walking across the road, they say, those idiots are not looking. Then you get out of your car and you become a pedestrian and you're the idiot. So we have these, different settings. And so when we come home from being a leader, I led organizations for 20 years as a CEO. And I came home and I was a husband and a father. Those are leadership roles as well. And so that's the first level for me of understanding. It's interesting when I run classes and seminars for people from different countries and different roles, I get leaders in nonprofit organizations, leaders from the military, leadership in corporate organizations. I've got entrepreneurs who are just doing startups. They all have different kind of settings in which they have to exercise leadership. So it's situational. And the interesting thing is that during these sessions, you see all kinds of cross-fertilization of ideas. Military leaders will bring an idea in for corporate leaders to think about, and there's a kind of a distillation, an aha moment. Oh, I didn't think about it that way. So that's the first thing, that it occurs in different settings. It's multidisciplinary.
Yes.
Now, the second element of it being multidisciplinary is that to exercise leadership, we need to understand that there are three essential domains or components that we have to pull together in order to become what I call integrated leaders. By being able to pull all of these together and being a holistic, integrated leader. So, as you mentioned, first domain of leadership is personal leadership. And that's where you define your key principles, governing principles and values that determine your actions and decisions, make you transparent and authentic, and are a source of inspiration to others. That's where it begins. That's the threshold requirement. I'm really interested in philosophy. And Confucius, if you go right back to the ancient sages, said if you want to be a leader, you must first be a human being. So that's where it begins. That, for me, is permission to lead. Next domain of leadership is strategic leadership, the ability to give an organization a clear sense of direction, a winning way, and a shared set of priorities. Third domain of leadership is interpersonal leadership. That's bringing out the best in others and building an organization where everybody else brings out the best in all of their colleagues. That's how organizations thrive. Now, as we address various changing challenges, we have to put the pressure on one or the other of these domains so they all pull together in a synergistic way. When we're confronted with a whole new paradigm externally, like artificial intelligence, for example, we need to think about strategic leadership. But that won't work unless the personal leadership is in place. And we need to ignite cooperation and passion in our employees to pursue that and give them the means and the tools to be able to do it. So, you realize that you have to put pressure in one or the other of these domains, but they will never work on their own in isolation. They only work together as a holistic model of leadership effectiveness.
All three domains are interdependent.
They're interdependent. And I think, they're there to achieve a purpose. I always like to say at the beginning of this, what's the job that we're trying to do as leaders? There's a job to do. And I found a very good definition of that job, of leadership, from a psychologist called Howard Gardner, who's written a number of books. He was the inventor of multiple intelligences and writes beautifully about the human condition and our psychological triggers that determine who we are and how we behave. And right there in the middle of an article about psychology, about human psychology, was this statement that I wrote down, which defined leadership in a way that I found very powerful. And what Howard Gardner said is the following: a leader is somebody who is able, through both words and actions to influence the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of those they seek to lead. Now, what I like about that is you can't just influence people's behavior. You can't just say to them, I want you to do this and I want you to do that. You'll get compliance, but you won't get commitment that way. You really have to work at this influencing both their thoughts, the way they think about the business, help them understand what drives the economic engine, help them understand what's happening in the external environment and the needs that, for us to respond effectively, and their feelings of commitment, of dedication, of passion. And so I love that definition. So I like to start with, well, what's the task? What are we striving to do? Then we go to the 3 domains of leadership to say, well, here are the means of thinking about it deliberately, intentionally, and building our leadership capability. Now, the power of this 3 domains system is it helps us to think intentionally about leadership in a structured way. It also helps us get very good feedback. There was a mayor in New York called Ed Koch way back.
How you doing? That's what he would ask people to tell him.
Yes, he would always walk around saying, how am I doing?
How am I
always
doing?
think that's the wrong question.
Right.
The right question is, how are you doing? Right. You want to be a mayor and serve people. Leadership's not about power. It's about service. But these 3 domains also help you to get very good feedback. Because instead of saying, how am I doing to others, people say, oh, you're doing fine. Well, that's not helpful. Better to be able to say, I'm thinking about these 3 areas I need to improve and keep thinking about. How am I doing on the personal leadership front? How am I doing on the strategic leadership front? Is everybody clear on the priorities in the organization? Well, do we have a winning way? Do we have a clear sense of direction? How can I sharpen that? And then interpersonal leadership. Are people working together in teams in a productive kind of way? And now you're getting better feedback because you've disaggregated leadership into its working pistons, if you like.
Yes. Well, that's so insightful. Unfortunately, as you know, so many so-called leaders try to lead by title or lead by executive decree or by announcement, and it doesn't work. Well, let me ask, what specific mindsets, actions, and habits can leaders adopt to help them learn to learn?
Well, again, I come to, what's the task? It's the understanding that leadership is multidisciplinary. So, if you think about the personal and interpersonal domains of leadership, you get a lot of insights from the social sciences, from understanding psychology, what makes people tick. Because a great thing in leadership, obviously, is to work through people. You never do it alone. To be able to unlock their passions and commitment, etc. So understanding how others tick, how others think, etc. That kind of level of thinking about leadership on the people front. So I've developed a habit, Roger, of reading widely. I do read business books, but let me make an admission to you here. It's probably 25% at the maximum of my reading. I skim through a lot of business books and business articles to be able to determine if there are any nuggets of gold.
Right.
And if there are, then I linger and I read it more thoroughly. But the books that I read cover to cover, I would say about 25% of them are specifically about leadership. Now, my leadership interests cover 3 main domains. There are others as well, but main domains. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what each one is and why. The first area of interest to me is philosophy. Now, the reason I like philosophy is because it shines a light on the 3 most important questions we need to address as we go through life and as we exercise leadership. the three questions that we always wrestle with. What's true, what's important, and what's right? And so often when we make decisions, we have to wrestle between right and right. Right and wrong, black and white, that's easy. But then the gray area of right and right, both right, what should I do? Now you link back to what's important. And there you determine where your values take you, your governing principles take you. And it's back to personal leadership. So I love that approach to philosophy. And I constantly think about those three questions and their answers. And then, of course, the fourth thing is, how should I act? Once you've determined this is important and this is right, how do I act? And that often takes moral courage. But it helps us think about our challenges in life in that way.
It kind of reminds me of the what, so what, now what?
Exactly.
Questions.
Exactly. I often put that up on a flip chart. So, you want to talk about strategy? Here's what it's about. What, so what, now what? Let's talk about each of those. Very practical, bring it down to earth. Now, the second thing I like about philosophy is Socrates and helping us answer questions that we learn through asking the right questions. So anyway, that's my first area of interest, and I read a lot of philosophy. I like the ancient sages. I've already mentioned Confucius. I like the Greeks and the Romans, and even the so-called Enlightenment philosophers. I talk about, earlier on, I talked about this domain of personal leadership. Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman philosopher and emperor, called that our command center. Now, I love that term. We all need to have a deliberate command center. These are our governing principles that are our internal command center. So that comes from philosophy as well. Second area of interest for me is evolutionary science, because that's about survival. And, Darwin's majestic book in 1859, Origin of Species, you can just strip down the key lesson there very, very simply. And that is the external environment is constantly changing, and we can't stop it from changing. And our only way of surviving is to be able to adapt successfully to those external changes. So you strip that down to how do I behave as a leader? It's outside in, not inside out. The external environment won't adapt to what we want to do. We have to adapt to the realities of the external environment. And that's the beginning of thinking about strategy and thinking outside in and not inside out. 99% of the species that have ever existed are now extinct.
Right.
Yeah, so that's an arresting thought, isn't it? Now, how are we doing in response to this clarion call? We've got to be adaptive systems in order to survive. How are we doing as businesses? Well, not very well. A McKinsey study showed that in the mid-20th century, average lifespan of companies in the S&P 500 was about 61 years. Not much shorter than a human life at that time. Today, it's 18 years. Now, that's catastrophic. We're not doing very well at adapting as organizations. And the only way that humans can adapt, unlike the animal and vegetable world, they're not sitting there and thinking about it. They're just subject to the hazards of change and being maladapted. We can think deliberately, and we can plan. We can understand the external environment and its demands. So our intelligence system becomes monumentally important. And that's the start of strategy.
It's interesting how the teachings of some of these people from centuries ago are so relevant today.
Exactly.
And it's sad that so many people are unaware of those teachings.
Timeless. These are timeless teachings.
Absolutely timeless. I've heard you say that if an organization cannot define its winning proposition in a simple way, it cannot claim to have a strategy. Tell us, how does that apply to an entrepreneur starting a new business?
Well, let's talk about this concept of a winning proposition to begin with and see where it fits in. Strategy is about winning. It was born in the military as a concept. It was not born in the business world. It was born in the military. And Von Clausewitz just defines our winning proposition as the decisive point in any battle. That's the difference between winning and losing, the decisive point. Now, we all need to develop in our businesses a decisive point that makes the difference between winning and losing. First order of business, and the same is true in the military, it always begins with great intelligence, outside in, never inside out. I've done a number of seminars at the Army War College in Carlisle in Pennsylvania, compared notes with the military folk in terms of how we do strategy. And it's always intelligence first, and as Sun Tzu said, the best way to win a battle is to win it before a single shot has been fired.
Right.
And that's your intelligence system. So we need to have that outside-in perspective. The second idea here is it's about winning. Now, what does that really mean? It means that you create greater value for the customers you seek to serve than any competing alternatives. Superior value, something unique that gives your customers a compelling reason to choose you. Now, the harsh truth about thinking about customers is they examine all of their choices with reference to the alternatives available to them. Everything is comparative in strategy. There are no absolutes. You've got competitors and you've got customers, you've got choices. So the idea of defining a value proposition is not nearly enough. It's not a comparative statement. Of course, everybody's doing value. The question is, how much value? What's the margin of difference in the value that you're offering that gives your customers a compelling reason to choose you? Now, let's talk about entrepreneurs, innovators doing a startup. And let's start with, what's the basic purpose of a business? It's to generate and retain customers. If you can't do that, you don't have a business. And if you do that efficiently, you'll make a lot of money. So the first order of business for any entrepreneur is, which customers do I seek to serve? What distinctive value will I bring to them that is better than any of the competing alternatives? We have to think about it in that comparative way.
And you have to look at it from the frame of reference of your target customer.
Exactly right. Not all customers want the same thing.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is that if you look in retrospect, all innovations seem to be obvious. There was a time there were no wheels on suitcases. I mean, if you went into a luggage shop and said, I'd like to buy a suitcase with wheels, they'd probably call up somewhere and say, there's some nutcase in the store.
Yes.
Now, try and go to a store and say, I'd like a suitcase without wheels, please. They say, well, what's the matter with you? You want to do weightlifting or something?
Right.
Now, there was also a time where there were no cup holders in cars. There weren't any. And I remember I was running Unilever's foods business in the USA, and I read an industry magazine, and it said something, and I was newly in the US. I'd just been transferred by Unilever from the UK. And I read this magazine, and it said, I can't remember the exact number, Roger, but something like 25% of all the calories consumed in the United States are consumed in cars.
Oh,
my goodness. I said, what kind of country have I come to?
A lot of fast food, I guess.
I flung the magazine away. I thought, I hope they're eating our stuff. Anyway, the car companies saw the same magazine. Oh, that's interesting. I did nothing about it. Now, what were you doing driving to work? Like, for example, where you live, You probably have to do a lot of driving to and fro. And you might want coffee, and you might want a sandwich at a certain point. Where are you going to put this if you don't have cup holders? Well, it's dangerous to drive with it in one hand, and if you spill something hot on your lap. So, along comes Honda and Toyota. I think Honda were the initial ones. With a cup holder, first time. And their market share went up. Why? Well, if I'm going to buy a car, I might as well have one with cup holders. Now try and buy a car without cup holders. Again, people will think you're nuts. And it seems obvious in retrospect. All of these, transformations seem obvious in retrospect. But the clever entrepreneur spots the gap, sees the need, is really got his or her antenna out to say, there's a gap somewhere here. There's an unfulfilled need. There's a job to be done that's not being done now. And so you see these innovations over and over based on these kinds of insights.
Sure. Try to buy a television without a remote control.
That's correct.
There is no such thing anymore.
There's no such thing. People used to get up and fiddle with it and fiddle with the ears on top of it, etc.
Right.
Exactly.
Hey there, Leadership listeners. We have something special for you. As a thank you for tuning in, we're offering you a free copy of Roger Dean Duncan's award-winning best-selling book, Change Friendly Leadership. In this book, you'll discover a proven framework for leading change that people will actually buy into, without all the stress and resistance that often stand in the way. You'll also learn powerful strategies to improve relationships both at work and at home, creating a healthier, more productive environment for everyone. To claim your free copy, just head over to changefriendly.com. Don't miss out on this opportunity to transform your good intentions into great performance. Again, grab your free copy of this best-selling book at changefriendly.com.
Tell us, what forms of bias can put a leader's success at risk?
Well, there's a wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman. He recently died. Brilliant guy, psychologist who got a Nobel Prize, and it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And again, another example of a non-business book that's been very influential for me. And that uncovers these numerous biases that we're all subject to. Nobody's immune from biases. And helps you think and be aware of them. And that's the only antidote, is awareness, the ability to govern your own mind as you make important decisions, because biases can derail your thinking. Starting point is to understand something about the human condition. There's nobody on earth who is totally objective. That doesn't exist. We are not wired that way.
Right.
We're wired with impulses and with emotions and with certain number of biases that are built in. And, as we go through life, I mentioned growing up in South Africa, these biases are absorbed through what's happening around you, and you just begin to take things for granted. That's the way the world is. So being able to monitor our own minds and think about those biases and counteract them becomes pretty important. The most prevalent bias, ironically, is the belief we all tend to harbor that everybody else is biased, but not us.
Right.
That's the way political parties work, right?
Right.
I think straight, but they're biased, and the other guy thinks the same way. They're both biased in some way or another. Nobody's totally objective. Now, I've stripped out from all my observations and doing strategy work with companies 4 main biases that I love to deal with at the outset of doing a strategy engagement, so that people can really begin to monitor their own thinking and call each other out so they make decisions that are more objective and rational, critical thinking skills. So
you start out challenging them to be more self-aware.
Exactly right. That's the point. And if you're not, these are blind biases.
Right.
Nobody turns around and says, I'm going to make an argument now, but, I'm subject to the confirmation bias. So please just, work with me here. Or I'm in denial, but let me just say this. People don't say, they don't work like that. They don't think that they're in denial. It's I'll take the four that I seek out are the confirmation bias, and that is the inclination we all have to come to an issue with a preconceived idea of what's true, so then selectively look for evidence to confirm what we already believe and discard and reject any disconfirming evidence. We're all subject to that. We're not born yesterday. We've got a worldview that's evolved over time, and we're seeking to validate it. We seek confirmation of what we already think. We think backwards from what we already believe to a conclusion. If we're not careful, and that's extreme, it can make us make terrible decisions. So that's the confirmation bias. Then you've got denial, when something is really unpleasant and you simply don't want to admit it. And you've got silos as well. I think of Kodak, for example. Kodak, if you go back in time, was one of these icons. 85% of the camera market, 90% of the film market, wonderful profitability and cash flow. In the late 1990s, they were the fifth most valuable company in the whole world. But they went broke.
And they thought digital photography was a passing fad.
Yeah. They went broke. You say, well, why did they go broke? You say, well, digital photography overtook them. Okay, well, who invented digital photography?
Right.
Kodak did. Well, this is an unbelievable story, but it's true. And an engineer called Mike Sasson, he was head of their development department, or a senior manager in the development department, very bright guy. He invented this and presented it to the leadership team. And they didn't like it because, of course, it would cannibalize their existing business. They found fault with it. Oh, this is a bit, it's a bit grainy. It's not as clear. He said, yeah, we can fix that. And then they said, but if we introduce this, it would destroy our existing business. And he said, yes, but if we don't, somebody else would do that. And they said, no, Mike, not if you don't tell them. Literally, he gave an interview to the New York Times. And so I can quote him. The leadership feedback to him was, Mike, that's a cute idea, but don't tell anybody about it. He didn't tell anybody about it. They invented it themselves. Kodak went broke when their own technology was used against them and sunk their whole boat. It's an extraordinary story. Something they just wanted to be in denial about. It's unwelcome. It's too painful. I'd rather deny that this is something that's going to be real. It's a real story.
And that can happen to any leader in any organization at any level.
Absolutely can. We do it all the time. I mean, politicians do this with climate change, for example. I mean, I think something like 90% of the scientists say it's real. There are uncertainties about when and, exactly how, but it's kind of like, it's emerging and we have to apply antidotes. And the politicians, not the scientists, there are some scientists who argue against it, etc., but 98% seem to be in favor. So now you've got a risk mitigation challenge, saying yes or no. It'll never happen or it will happen. That's silly. I mean, we all take fire insurance. Nobody turns around and says, well, I'm not going to have a fire. I'm different. You take fire insurance, not because there's a certainty of a fire, but because if it happens, it's devastating. So this is a clear case of risk mitigation. Now, because the risks are high, the stakes are very high here. So many of the politicians don't like the cure, which is inconvenient and expensive, so they deny the disease. They just call it a hoax.
Yes. That raises another question, and it's about questions.
Yes.
In what ways does skill with asking questions help a leader make wise decisions? Questions about the leader's own assumptions, questions about somebody else's assumptions.
Yes.
But skill with asking questions.
Everything we know comes from a question somebody asked, in science and in general knowledge. Breakthroughs, knowledge, ideas don't just drop out of the blue sky. There's a process involved, and we should be aware of it. This is where Socrates comes in and taught us the power of asking penetrating questions that unlock ideas. His mother was a midwife, and he observed her profession and was interested in the fact that she didn't give birth to babies. She facilitated their delivery.
Yes.
And he said, I don't give birth to ideas. I facilitate their delivery. And the means of facilitation is asking great questions.
Right.
That unlock ideas. And the best questions are generative, meaning they give rise to ideas that didn't exist before. I give one example of a question that won a war, and I'm referring here to the Revolutionary War, War of Independence that was fought in 1776, that all the American listeners will be aware of. And there were 13 independent colonies, and George Washington was given the role of pulling them together and fighting against the most formidable army in the world at the time, the War of Independence. Very asymmetrical. Big power imbalance between the two. British forces much more experienced, much more advanced, more resources. So you just have to be cleverer to win a battle like that. It's not like playing a game of chess. You each get given the same resources and you're told, now play. It's always an imbalance. Well, the story goes, and this is from the journals that were kept at the time, and historians like David McCulloch have chronicled this. Apparently, in the early stages, the American revolutionary forces were losing rather badly. Washington gathered his senior officers in a circle and said, we've got to talk because we're not winning now, we're losing. And we've got to address this question as a fighting force. And of course, the morale was very low, is how can we defeat the British? And the conversation went on and on and on with ideas being thrown, more and more kind of, really bizarre ideas eventually. None of them were seen to be practical. So that won't work and that won't work. Well, it was very dispiriting until a senior officer put up his hand and said, I think we're asking the wrong question. There's no good answer to the question of how can we win. The real question is, how can we avoid losing? Now, that gave rise to this whole concept of commando raids, surprise raids against the British columns, rapid withdrawals before taking losses, doing it repeatedly with the expectation that it would exhaust the British, that they would then eventually go home.
And demoralize them.
And demoralize them. It used to be that kind of, formal confrontation of forces in those days. So the commando raid idea was kind of, hey, listen, you guys don't play cricket, right? You should play fair here.
Right.
But, you're playing to win. And so these commando raids had that effect. And then obviously with the help of the French at the final push, as we know, it worked. That question won a war.
You quote Warren Buffett as saying that the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. How does that apply to leaders?
It's all about having the right number of priorities. And if you're going to have the right number of priorities, you have to be good at subtraction because we're overloaded constantly. What are we going to focus on? If you try and do everything, you'll do nothing very well.
Right.
Now, this is a tough discipline to think about priorities because you're back to those questions. What's truly important? What's right, et cetera, what I'm going to focus on for success. People don't like to subtract. There's a sense of loss when you subtract something. And self-doubt, maybe I should do this, maybe I shouldn't do that. You have to be resolute. Now, it used to be, Roger, that we all said no more than 5 priorities. Well, that's wrong. A guy called Nelson Cowan from Missouri State University did some really good research on what he called working knowledge, working memory, the number of things we can retain in our minds and still function effectively. And the number is 3, maximum 4, not 5. And it's exponential. When you go more than 4, it's like falling off a log. A study of 4,000 executives in companies that had 5 priorities. The finding was that only 28% of them could remember 3. So it's a hopeless thing. So I've completely changed now, 3, maximum 4. And that's the discipline. Here we learn from nature. My office here, just if I look beyond my computer screen, I've got a balcony, and that looks over, I'm very lucky here. I'm on the 33rd floor. It looks over Central Park and eventually in the little blue hills of New Jersey. And it's wonderful. My wife is a writer, and she has a balcony off her office, and I have a balcony off my office. And eventually she said to me one day, she's very creative, let's beautify our balconies. I said, I don't know what you mean. She said, let's plant geraniums around the railings, which we did. Made a big difference. I love this kind of sense of a garden, on the balcony. And I had a client, he came in, and somebody who came in regularly to brainstorm. We used to stand on the balcony and think about the meaning of life. And he looked over at my wife's balcony and he said, Willie, look at those beautiful geraniums. I said, well, Tom, yeah, those are Laura's geraniums. These are mine here on this balcony. And he said, yeah, I see that. Why do they look so insipid? I thought, well, that's nice. He insulted my geraniums. Anyway, when he left, I said to Laura, I've noticed your geraniums are better than mine. Tom was completely right. So you're obviously cheating. What have you done? Is it, cow manure? Is it Miracle Grow? Or what are you doing? Because we water it on the same day. It faces the same, direction. She said, no, let me show you. She took a pair of scissors and a garbage bag. She came to my balcony and brutally assaulted my geraniums. And I said, what are you doing? You're destroying my garden.
She was thinning the herd.
Yeah. She said, no, I'm not destroying it. I'm creating it. This is called deadheading. And sure enough, she said, just wait a week. And my garden flourished. I love to make sense of these things. Sometimes drive her crazy. She said, oh, God, here we go again with your philosophy. I said, well, look, I've learned something here. Whenever you remove the underperforming parts of any living system, all the remaining energy in that system gets concentrated on the few things that matter most, and that system will flourish, whether it's your garden or your business. Universal law, inescapable. So, we have to be driven by these things. Sometimes we have choices. Other times we're constrained by laws. This is a law. It's not a choice. So the idea of being able to focus on 3 or maximum 4 priorities, stripping out the things that are less important, understanding, that's one of the biggest responsibilities of a CEO, is understanding what's important.
That teaching that you just shared with us is worth the entire conversation. That is very, very rich. Willie, among your consulting clients, what seem to be their most common challenges, and how do you help them deal with those challenges?
Well, the same challenges we all face. I just happen to think more deliberately about them, I guess. And first is thinking inside out rather than outside in. And sometimes in the conversation, they say, I want you to help us. Here's our vision. And I find myself saying, because I always ask for permission, Roger, please give me permission to say what I think. Your job is to decide what you think. Now, let me tell you what I think about starting with a vision. Nobody gives a damn about what you're trying to do. External world only cares about what they get. Never start with a vision. That's internal. Go external first. Who are the customers you wish to serve? What are their most important needs? How are you going to win the battle for value creation there? Now, what's your vision based on that? Outside in. So the first thing is to get rid of this totally natural inside-out thinking. It is a natural thing. I mean, if you walk into the canteen of a company at lunchtime and saying, can I join you folk at this table? And they're having a conversation about who's who in the zoo and the company. Are we going to be taken over? Is there going to be a joint venture? My boss is worse than your boss. That's the conversation. Mm-hmm. And then you sit down and say, thank you. I'd love to join you. Let's talk a bit about what you think our customers' most important needs are. And they're going to turn around and say, listen, this is lunchtime. You're giving us indigestion. So it's, they did research, some psychologists did research on the content of informal conversations when there's no formal agenda, people just chatting, friends. 75% of it is gossip, which who's who and who can we trust and, who are our enemies and et cetera, et cetera. So it's the natural kind of thing to do, to think about your immediate environment that way. So that's the first thing. The second is no strategy document should ever be longer than 10 pages. If it's longer than that, it's a general anesthetic. Right. Nobody reads it. And if you can't distill it into 10 pages, you can't really claim to have a strategy that others would understand and follow. Now, I will just say this, I don't give away any confidential information, but one of my clients, ExxonMobile, the last round of strategy I did with them is 9.5 pages for a giant global company, stripping it down to its essentials. Mm-hmm. And so I think simplicity, the whole idea, I think in a complex world, is to create increasing simplicity from a world of increasing complexity, because complexity will paralyze your organization. Distilling, simplifying, and prioritizing lies at the heart of strategy.
That applies to personal lives too, of course.
Oh, absolutely right, it does.
How can leaders make it safe for their people to manage up and speak truth to power in ways that enhance the performance of all the players?
Well, first is a realization that as you go up in an organization, you're going to suffer from what I call the curse of power. Now, the curse of power takes a couple of forms. First of all, you are further and further removed from ground level, which is where the action occurs. The action does not occur in the executive suite. It occurs on the ground. And the greater the distance you have from what's happening on the ground, the more removed you are, the less you'll understand the realities of the battlefield. So you have to have techniques visiting the battlefield, the marketplace, regularly, and being seen to do it, so you're setting the example for other senior executives. Second curse of power, and you need to guard against this. If people have a tendency to tell you what they think you like to hear. And I sometimes say to a CEO, newly appointed, have you noticed that your jokes have suddenly become funnier?
Right.
So we really have to have that self-awareness again. In terms of, you want two truth tellers. If you don't have truth tellers, you're going to get buried in these biases and this kind of satisfaction about I'm powerful and look, I'm succeeding because everybody tells me that. And, as somebody once said to me, praise is good as long as you don't inhale.
Yes. You offer a wise reminder that there is no such thing as a non-decision.
Yeah.
Why do so many leaders seem to have missed that truth, and what's the cost to their effectiveness?
It's back, Roger, to asking the right questions. Because if we let a big issue drift, we've got artificial intelligence now. It's going to affect every single business and activity in the world. It's not escapable. You can't say, well, it doesn't apply to me. It's back to this thing, we've got laws and we've got choices. And then the question becomes, how are we going to deal with this? It's back to asking the right questions. So for me, a very, very important question about an unresolved issue is, what will happen if we do not do this? And, this is the question that Kodak should have asked itself.
Certainly.
In a more serious way, rather than in a dismissive way. What will happen if we don't do this? The truth of the matter is that the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. So the consequences of inaction are often even more profound than the consequences of action. And that's, I think, the understanding we need to have. That comes back to this questioning. What are the alternatives available to us? What will happen if we don't do this? And for every action that we intend to take, how will this compare with not doing it? Because if it doesn't improve on not doing it, you better think again. And so there are always two alternatives in making a decision. At a minimum, is doing something and understanding what would happen if you don't do that. When the great crisis happened in 2007-8, I think it was, and there was this massive package of relief, big political debate in Congress. Some people said, we're doing too much, and others said, we're doing too little. And then it played out, and, we got over the problem. And people still retrospectively say, we spent too much money. Well, against what standard? I think it would have been much better to say at the outset, if we don't do this, economic impact will be X. It's an estimate. If we do spend this money, economic impact will be Y. There's the delta between the two. So now after the event, when you have an argument, you can say, well, look, this is the difference we made against not doing it. And that's the end of the argument, as opposed to, well, you should have spent more, should have spent less.
The history of business is littered with people who didn't learn that lesson. I mean, we look at Blockbuster.
Yes.
And what they said about Netflix.
Yes, and now streaming. I mean, it's interesting to see Disney realizing, the pressures on its profitability in the media industry for Disney owning ABC is they're not really making much money. In fact, I think they're making losses on the traditional broadcast avenues, channels, that it's all shifted to streaming. Well, the only company that's really making serious money in streaming now is Netflix.
Right.
But if you don't get into streaming and find a way, you're going to be left out of the whole thing. So that's one of the kind of really important thing. And it's, Disney thinking about these three priorities. Iger has been very, very clear. Iger has been very, very clear on these three priorities. Is excel at content, which Netflix have done.
Mm-hmm.
Get into streaming and make some money in it, because there's no more money in traditional broadcast avenues. And third is make sure that you drive your experiences business, which is the theme parks and the cruises. Three priorities. But it all starts with, they're all interrelated. The content is interrelated to the streaming, because if you just get onto streaming with poor content, you're going to make terrible losses. So, there's a cause and effect. But everybody's concentrating on those three priorities now in Disney.
Well, Willie, what question do you wish I had asked but didn't, and how would you respond?
Well, I was afraid you might ask a question that I have no answer to whatsoever.
Oh.
Ultimately, what's the key to success? Well, I think my answer to that is celebrate progress, not perfection. And I think is the only way I think about, how these things happen. And if we want to be successful, it happens in steps, one step at a time. Very seldom just one big leap from where we are to great success. But the questions that you asked are good ones. The questions that I like most are those that help me think. And if I have one wish, is that this would go on for another half an hour, and you would ask great questions that help me think more.
I love good questions, and I love talking with smart people like you, Willie. Thank you so much. It's clear why so many people for so many years have turned to you for wise counsel on leadership issues. We so appreciate your being with us.
Thank you so much, Roger. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. To learn more about Willie and his work, go to williepietersen.com. That's Willie, Willie, Pietersen, Pietersen.com. And to grab a free copy of my book, Change Friendly Leadership, go to changefriendly.com. That's changefriendly.com. In other episodes of Leadership, I share my exclusive conversations with many more top thought leaders who offer smart tips to boost your effectiveness in both your professional and personal life. My guests include superstars like Stephen M. R. Covey, Liz Wiseman, Doug Conant, Heather Younger, Marshall Goldsmith, Amy Edmondson, Bill George, Jessica Chin, Guy Kawasaki, and many others who have insightful things to say that you can put to good use immediately. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay informed on what's coming your way. Trust me, folks, you don't want to miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.